Hi, welcome to session one of the ninth topic of the semester. This is the last topic of the semester. This is the ninth topic titled Texas in the Age of Globalization from 1939 to the present. So this is the last topic. We're going to now cover the remaining portion of the 20th century and looking also into our contemporary era as well. To look at the Texas state and see how Texas is transforming in a more significant way, even more so than all the previous transformations that we have covered so far, even though they were very meaningful. The transformations we covered, for example, the Texas entering the modern era, for example. We covered that in the previous topic. Texas entering the modern age, the age of progress. We cover all that, very, very fully. And so those changes were extremely meaningful. They were changing the way people lived, the traditional ways of the past. That is to say, Texas was a very, very traditional state, really, that the ways of life, the traditions have, really, they really go back many, many generations. This conservative setting, so to speak, that was really, a setting in which people lived. Primarily, they subsisted from their own activity, their own work. For example, there were farmers, for example, in Texas. There were cattle ranchers in Texas, really going back to the Spanish colonial era. Okay, even when you examine, of course, Texas history going back to the Spanish colonial era, it had been a very, very conservative province back in the colonial period, when it was part of Spain. There were religious missionaries spreading Catholicism in the missions. They were Christianizing or baptizing, evangelizing the Native American population and so on. We see the development of cattle ranching and farms very early on. And it was a very, very traditional setting. The way people lived, the way people did work, the way people socialized as well was rather conservative. And this conservative environment really maintained itself even into the period when Texas becomes part of Mexico, the Mexican period. The Mexican period was really the continuity of Spanish society, again, now in the nation of Mexico, when we talk again about Texas, for example. It was still very conservative, the way people lived, the way people, for example, carry out their religious activities, Catholicism and the like. Of course, there were deep changes we were looking at when we talk about, for example, colonization, American colonization. Of course, there's going to be new ideas. We talked about that all very extensively. Americans are going to bring the ideas of capitalism. They're going to bring political ideas of representation, natural rights, separation of church and state, Protestantism as well. So we're going to see Texas society really changing very rapidly and very dramatically. But still, the ways that people actually did work were pretty much maintained. They were still largely agricultural. An agricultural society of farmers and cattle ranchers and the like, but it was becoming more and more culturally and ethnically diverse, with the arrival of different groups coming from particularly the United States. And so this setting, again, was pretty much preserved even into the process of independence, when Texas gains independence from Mexico, becomes a republic, an independent republic. This conservative environment, this conservative setting pretty much maintained, again, in terms of people living in the countryside for the most part. It was an agricultural economy, an agricultural society per excellence, with cattle ranching as well. It was pretty much standard, in terms of how people actually carry out their activities and so on. So it is not really until we see the process of the Civil War, when Texas becomes part of the Union, and of course we see the secession crises. We examined that, quite extensively in the past. That Texas is now rapidly changing, particularly after Reconstruction. Okay, with the ending of slavery, the introduction of a wage labor economy now in Texas, the transformation of agriculture into commercial agriculture, mechanization of agriculture as well, agricultural technologies, and so on. New industries are on the rise, manufacturers, etc. We cover all of that, of course, and the rise of big cities. In the state of Texas, that really initiated, dramatic transformations, in the state. But the topic that we're going to cover here, again, Texas in the Age of Globalization, really goes even way beyond, again, most of the changes that we have actually talked about, in that now what Texas experiences and the world at large, by the way, this is not just an isolated experience, is that when we move into the 20th century, particularly the second half of the 20th century, is that the world is going to be now moving towards a new age. Okay, it's called the Age of Globalization. And there will be more change taking place in Texas, and it will be more change taking place around the world. In traditional societies, in traditional settings like Texas, for example, there will be very traditional cultures around the world that are beginning to change very, very dramatically. And that the values of modernity that we discussed so fully in the previous topic, again, in the eighth topic, those values are going global. In other words, that the world was modernizing, in other words. And so very conservative societies, civilizations that have remained pretty much constant in very traditional settings, in the way people dress, the way people worship, the way people, treated each other and thought about the world. That, again, with globalization, those conservative settings are beginning to rapidly change and modernize, because we're now becoming part of a global, community, that is to say. So let us then move to our outline. Again, this is the title. This is the ninth topic. This is the last topic of the semester, titled Texas in the Age of Globalization from 1939 to the present. And so once again, what we're going to be looking at here is now Texas becoming integrated into this now new global community, this new global setting that is on the rise. Even today, as we speak today, again, in the 21st century, this is still, what humanity is experiencing is called globalization. And more, the societies of the world are becoming quite more and more in contact with one another, more integrated, at least from a commercial or economic standpoint, but it goes far beyond just economic integration. Globalization, of course, is a multidimensional, process. It's a multidimensional change that we will have to assess here in this topic. What is globalization? And what we're going to be doing in this last topic is how Texas was changing because of this new global phenomenon. Again, we're going to see deeper change taking place in the way people live, in the way people do work, to the point that, is now more recognizable, when we talk about, for example, today, people living in Texas, for example, in large cities, for example, such as Houston or Dallas, San Antonio, etc., it will be far more recognizable. Again, after we go through this topic, it will be easier to recognize, how is it that we got here? In other words, it's really not that, that old. The way that the Texas state has changed it's been a 20th century phenomenon for the most part. Okay, and the way people live, the diversity of the state, for example, the new technologies, etc. All of that came into being, in the late 20th century, particularly the second half of the 20th century. So this is again something that I have elaborated again. This is a topic to close the semester by placing Texas in a larger context, again, in the context of the world, stage, as a global perspective, if you will. We are going to pay exclusive attention, of course, to Texas, but we're going to make a connection of events taking place in Texas, changes, and so on, with the global scene, okay? Because Texas is not really isolated or cut off from the rest of the world. It's very much becoming more and more integrated with the rest of the world. So the table of contents, again, we're going to look at 3 parts in this topic. The first part is going to be Texas, and looking at Texas during World War II. Okay, particularly, again, we're going to actually start more or less around 1939. The previous topic that we covered, we ended in 1939, again, with the New Deal. So here we're going to kind of move in the timeline as well, with that as well. After the New Deal, after the Great Depression, came World War II. So we're looking at war. Also, that there will be, because the United States and Texas, of course, is going to move into this wartime industrial production and agricultural production. There will be greater and greater prosperity, something that will be maintained even after the war comes to an end. So we're going to see in this first part also prosperity and modernization. In the second part, we're going to look at a rapid transition that Texas is going through between the years of 1960 and 1986. There's drastic change taking place politically. For example, there's social movements as well. There's the civil rights movement we're going to pay attention to. The demographics is changing as well, in Texas. So we're going to look at that as well. Texas in transition. And the third part is going to look at the rise of a new Texas again. We're going to look at the latter part of the 20th century, a new Texas, because there is reform taking place. There's economic reform in the state. Many of the policies of the New Deal that we discussed, back in the 1930s, are being abandoned, and there's a new type, or there's a return to, I should say, to an economic organization, economic policies that really go back before the Great Depression. So we're going to actually pay attention to that, and how we're going to see the rise of a new society as well, more culturally diverse. Certain cities are going to become centers for immigration. The issue of immigration is also going to look at the border and so on. All of that again in part 3. All right. So this is again what we're going to discuss for the following 3 sessions. And so we start then with the general introduction. So it's extremely important before we start looking at for example, war, prosperity, and modernization. And Texas will be rapidly, changing. That's exactly what we are going to look at here in this session. In the first part, war, prosperity, and modernization, is to first and foremost offer a quick overview of what globalization is, because Texas is now entering the age of globalization, and many of the changes that we're about to discuss from here on are directly or indirectly related to globalization. So what does it mean? In other words, what is globalization, and how is this going to shape Texas history in the 20th century? Okay, and again, this is something that even uh, other societies around the world, are shaped by it as well. Okay, so this is more like a sort of synthesis. This is a grand synthesis, a grand summary, if you will, of what globalization is, what it entails, and how this is influencing the development, the path of human societies moving forward. How we're changing, and what kind of future are we moving into as we're now experiencing this thing called globalization. Okay, so let's look at as a general introduction at globalization itself. So first and foremost, please understand that despite the fact that uh, globalization is something that we now refer to as a phenomenon of the 20th century, okay, a 20th century phenomenon. And we tend to look at the 20th century, the second half, etc., even the end of the 20th century, even today, as okay, this is the age of globalization. That in reality, globalization is a centuries long historical process that has been around for at least 7 or 8 centuries. It's something in the making, that is to say, that when we look back and you say, okay, so when globalization actually started, uh, the whole process of globalization started back in the 1200s, particularly the latter part of the 1200s. Okay, so centuries old, 7, 8 centuries. And what it is then is that globalization is simply, again, a phenomenon in which all of the continents of the world and all of the civilizations and the groups that inhabit those continents are now not only coming into contact with one another, but we see the integration, the gradual integration of the world's uh, civilization and societies and groups, all of which inhabit different parts of the globe in different continents again. See it as a process in which the human species is now coming together, very gradually, by the way. Okay, it's a very, very gradual process, like the dawn, if you will, of a global community. Okay, let it just see it like that. Because for thousands of years, the human species has been pretty much separated, okay, into different groups. When you examine, human history going back, thousands and thousands of years. The human species have developed in different parts of the world. Some in Africa, some in Europe, in Asia, the Middle East, and Australia, and America again. But around the 1200s, starting in the 1200s, late 1200s, and into the 1300s and beyond, all of those groups, okay, all over the planet are beginning to now encounter one another, and they're beginning to establish more steady, permanent, or semi-permanent relationships with one another. Okay, so this is a beginning stage, what we call globalization. Okay, and that took place, that happened with the rise of international trade. Okay, we covered that very, very quickly again. We were talking about, for example, in the second topic, when we were talking the second and third topics in the very beginning of the semester, when we were talking about the Spanish background, for example, how the Spaniards, were part of a trend in Europe going on that was connecting Europe with different groups, different civilizations of the world. It's called international trade. This is the rise of international trade, Europeans stepping outside of their own continent, of their own borders, to make contact with other societies in different parts of the world to engage in commercial exchange, like silks and spices and so on. We talked about that. I'm not going to repeat myself here. But what that led to, is that as more and more people are establishing commercial relationships, they're exchanging products across vast distances, we're going to see networks, okay? Trading networks, so to speak, in that, again, people are pretty much establishing now relationships, okay? Some of them are somewhat permanent, others are very fragile, if you will, But nonetheless, the human species is now, all of the groups, again, of the human species are now encountering one another. They're beginning to communicate or establish treaties or partnerships, exchange, and there's now the trade again taking place, the flow of commercial products worldwide. And all of those economies, the local and regional economies that existed all over the planet, are beginning to kind of connect with one another again, because they're now producing products for exports, they're connecting with each other, and they're pretty much coming together again. Commercially speaking, there's a network again that connect many producers from many parts of the world. So this is again the beginning stages, the early stages of what is called globalization. Okay, the rise of international trade, and it has been around for 8 centuries. 8 centuries. So this is extremely important. Again, and that how slowly but surely all of the groups of the world, all of the groups and civilizations are beginning to now establish more and more communication and more exchange. Okay. And instead of being totally cut off and isolated from the rest of the world, people are all beginning to now see that the world is populated, again, by many types of cultures, that there's multiplicity, a wide variety of different cultural expressions, languages, religions, and so on, all of that, okay? But in the beginning, it was all more commercial. The relationships were more commercial, bringing the world together, okay? And of course, in the 20th century, this process is going to simply accelerate manifold to the point that all of the economies of the world are beginning to connect with one another, again, through an already existing trading network, that was already there, but is becoming far more interconnected and interdependent. And that's exactly what international trade is going to do, particularly as we arrive to the 20th century, is that the economies of the world are become far more interconnected and interdependent. They're not absolutely, okay, totally 100% interdependent, but the reality is, as the 20th century opened up, is that it was very rare to find a place in the world that was not integrated somehow to the world economy, okay, because countries needed trade. I mean, to say that a country was totally 100% self-sufficient, that it did not need anything from the outside, that was very rare. Usually that's what leads countries to trade. That some of the things that are abundant in your country might not be abundant in others, and vice versa. And people trade those, of course. And so that's exactly, again, what is going to happen to the world at large is going to, Texas as well. So Texas is going to now connect with the world economy. Okay, we're going to see that process unfolding in a very profound way. The Texas economy is going to now not just connect with the national economy of the U.S., which already is connected, by the way. We talked about that again in previous topics. with the building of railroads and so on and so forth, investment and the development of industries. Yeah, so something produced in Texas is consumed outside of the state in the United States. We talked about that, like cattle, for example, and so on. So yes, there's now a national economy, and something produced locally in any city, region, or state is consumed all over the country. Okay, because of transportation purposes, but the same principle is now applying to the world. Okay, as we move into the 20th century, now something produced in Texas finds markets all over the world. Okay, so the Texas economy is going to be now moving at a very fast rate to plug itself to the international economy. Okay, so this is a slow process, by the way. Okay, this is not to say that overnight, all of a sudden, again, Texas is now part of the international economy. But, just like Texas was integrated into the U.S. national economy, it will be integrated into the international economy in this age of globalization. And part of this, why this is really occurring, this globalization process in a more profound way in the 20th century, why we tend to point out, in other words, that the 20th century, that this is the century of globalization, despite the fact that it has been, a centuries old, centuries long process, is that in the 20th century, we are now looking at a technological revolution. Okay, and in certain facilities, in certain technologies that are going to connect the world together. Remember, this is an interconnected, interdependent world. So how is it that in the 20th century the world will become so much interconnected? Well, because there's communication systems. There's new ones. There are some that were developed back in the late 19th century, like the telegraph and the telephone. By the way, they're still here with us, even though the telegraph by now, again, is becoming, rather obsolete with the age of internet. Okay, but when we opened up the 20th century, the first half of the 20th century, we also saw, the coming of the radio and the television as well. So you can broadcast messages and you can hear news that occur in different parts of the world. Okay, you can hear news of what happens in Europe, what kind of economic problems other societies have, what kind of political upheavals occur in Latin America or in Asia or in different parts of the world. Again, you can now have instantaneous knowledge, information about what occurs elsewhere. In the television, another piece of technology that enables people to also share communication. There's, of course, now visuals. You can see people, that are, not only hundreds of miles, thousands of miles away from you and so on. You can see broadcasting, visuals as well from live news in many cases of what occurs in other parts of the country, what occurs in other parts of the world as well. So what this is doing is that people are now gaining the sense that the world that they inhabit is also shared by different peoples, not only Americans, of course. You can see what other Americans are thinking or doing or saying through the television, etc., or your political leaders, when they're broadcasting messages and so on, or etc. And there's political campaigns and so on. So even the world of politics will be transformed with the radio and the television. But in addition to that is that what this communication system is going to do is that it would reveal, if you will, to the people that have access to television again, that the world is also occupied by a multiplicity of different peoples again. That this very, very localized view of the world that people had in the past, in which the only thing that they knew was their community. Okay. People that were just like them, in other words. Okay. In the past, prior to the television age and the age of radio and so on, it was, again, news traveled very slow. News. It was just newspapers, by the way. Yeah. But you need to have access to newspapers, and sometimes newspapers broadcast the news that were part of the state or the locality or perhaps the country. But now, uh, people are going to expand, or at least the opportunity is there for people to start expanding their horizons, expanding their view of the world to actually encompass and include people that are very different from us, that they speak different, they think different, they have different religions, they have different ways of worship, they eat different kinds of food, and so on. In other words, that what your province, your state, your locality is just one of many. Again, the ones that actually live in the planet. Okay, so that opens up again the opportunity to develop a global outlook. Okay, that you live in a world that is populated by hundreds again of hundreds of millions of people that are radically different. Okay, from you, they dress different and so on. So again, this is one way that Texas enters the age of globalization, is through information. Again, through the television, through being exposed now to the outside world. Okay, so again, so globalization is not just the economic integration. That's one way of seeing that, but it's also it's a psychological integration as well. Okay, that people are beginning to see them integrated, into the world in a way that the world is shrinking and shrinking with more instantaneous information, instantaneous messages, visuals, or news that you gather from around the world. That people are now gaining the sense that they all live in the same planet. That the planet is not as big as they thought it was, even though it is, but that technology is bringing people together. Okay, and of course, when we move into the late 20th century, the age of internet, for example, okay, satellites and the World Wide Web, this is going to simply accelerate, okay, this globalization process, because now you can actually chat or speak or see and so on people living, let's say, in Japan or in India. You might have a friend in Argentina and so on. Again, places that were considered on the other end of the world, that in order to get there or to talk to people there, you will spend many months traveling and so on. So again, this is going to bring people together. Okay, bring them together. Technology is accelerating, the phenomenon of globalization, this interconnected, world, interdependent world, modern communication systems. So this traditional setting that I was speaking about, that existed in Texas for so long, going back to the colonial period, for example, a traditional way of life, the way people behave, the way people carried out their daily work, and so on, that this is going to rapidly change because of technology. Okay, like communication systems, for example. People now have exposed. They're being exposed to other ways of doing work. New technologies, new ideas, and so on. So slowly but surely, again, the society of Texas is beginning to change in terms of now having now the opportunity to visualize, okay, themselves, whether they want to see themselves as members of a community or the members of a state or a nation, that to visualize that they're also members of a planet, okay, like a global consciousness, a global identity. And even though that takes time to develop, now the first seed has been planted in the 20th century with, again, new technologies. All right. So at any rate, so now, um, besides, let me just, I perhaps even, yeah. So I was also going to mention that there's also, besides communication systems, there's of course transportation systems. Okay, so transportation systems are also part of this process of change, not just communication, but people are also traveling faster than ever. In the 20th century, there's the automobile. We talked about automobiles, by the way, uh, in the previous topic when we're talking about, for example, the Great Depression. Talk about the automobile industry. Um, so there's automobiles, and they're innovated every year. They're improved. There's you know uh, new features, new structures that are added to it, and so on. There's a wide variety of different models and so on, that allows people to travel faster than before. You can now, move, from place to place at your own time, your own schedule, your own convenience. You can travel out of state. You can travel out of the country. If other countries have, of course, uh, highways, of course, a system of highways as well. Again, it's a new development. Of course, airplanes. You get also airplanes on the rise that will enable, of course, people to take a flight. They fly out of state. They go to other countries to do business, for traveling, vacationing, and so on. So that also opens up, okay, this awareness of this interdependent, interconnected world. Again, that we're all part of, a larger and larger communities, because more than ever, people across the planet in the 20th century, through particularly airplanes, are able to travel around the world and see the world directly, in the ways other societies live and so on. And of course, there's people that also visit the United States. There's people that actually move into the United States too. There's people that come to Texas. They're immigrants that are arriving from Asia, for example, whether they're from India or they're from the Middle East or they're from China, etc., or from Eastern Europe and the like. There's also even peoples coming from Africa as well, to different cities of Texas. We're going to get there eventually, looking at the very end of the topic. So, that is part of globalization. Okay. It's part of this globalized worldview, in which people are now coming into terms with the reality again that we're becoming far more integrated. In other words, that the human species is becoming far more integrated, that the ways of the past in which people live in very isolated, very traditional settings, again, because of globalization, because of technology, that setting is coming now to an end in an accelerated rate. Okay. Um, Now, number three is that globalization is also something uh, that has occurred, from the technological revolution of the 20th century in terms of space exploration. Okay, the space age. Okay, the space age was also another part of this technological revolution, besides communication systems and transportation systems being accelerated and revolutionized, that lead again, make people feel more integrated into this global community, so to speak. Um, the space age is also part of that, because when human beings began to develop technology in order to explore outer space, okay, well, by by default, what that meant is that people realized that the human species, of course, is the one that inhabits this planet. In other words, that the planet is like a village, okay? It's like a localized community of the solar system. And that all of the human beings that live here are simply members of this global village, in other words, this global community. And we're trying to determine or discover if there are other species living in different parts of the solar system. Maybe we can actually colonize Mars or colonize the moon, etc. Move outward and so on. So just the fact that there's an aspiration now to move outside of the planet to explore outer space makes everything seem so small, and because we're now talking about cosmic space. It's not just Earth space, it's the space of the Earth, and that we're separated by continents. Well, that doesn't mean anything anymore. That there's oceans separating, America from Asia or America from Africa and Europe doesn't mean anything, because now we have technologies that allow us to fly over the entire planet. But what about technologies that allow us to step outside of the planet and see perhaps the planet from afar? That we're part of this particular species, and that instead of thinking about Earth space, we're now talking about cosmic space. In other words, stepping outside of our locality. The Earth is our localized space, and we're trying to really explore outer space, cosmic space. So it has an effect in our consciousness. The human species, again, with the coming of the space age, is going to now develop the idea of a global identity. In other words, that we're part of the same species again, and of course, the fact that we're establishing satellites in outer space. Um, for communication purposes, that of course led to uh, the cell phones, the World Wide Web, computers, the information age, and like I said, the world is becoming now more and more interconnected. In other words, that the internet is really providing the very first foundation for the development of a global mind, in other words, because thoughts, ideas are now instantaneously traveling around the world. The thoughts of humanity are all in the World Wide Web. Okay, you can know what other people are thinking instantaneously. Okay, at the reach of your fingertips. In other words, you can now communicate a thought, or you can read a thought again instantaneously. Okay, instantaneously. Um, so that also creates the sense of a global conversation. We're sharing thoughts, we're sharing ideas, emotions, with all of the members of the human species instantaneously. Okay, and the uh, uh, the internet will become, in reality, um, a the new public square. Okay, because in the past, if you really wanted to communicate, a thought or an idea, or broadcast a message, some news, you needed to go to the public square and pretty much, scream, so people can actually assemble there and hear you, But now, if you want to do that, if you want to communicate a thought, an emotion, or an idea, or anything, all you need to do is just go online again and do it. So, of course, Texas will be connected again to the world in terms of the internet. It will be part of that. So that also, creates, this globalized, identity as well. Okay. That's, of course, very, very important. Let's see. Okay. So, at any rate, let me see. All right. So, besides that, it is also significant to note that we're going to see as a result of all the changes that we have discussed, the international trade, for example, commercial exchange, the interconnectedness, interdependency of the world economies and the world societies and so on through new technologies like communication systems, transportation systems, the space age, is that we're also going to see, of course, the emergence, as a consequence of that, the emergence of a global community. Okay, in the global community and a multicultural world. Okay, this is extremely important. How we're going to see now the emergence of a global community and a multicultural world as a result, particularly again, of all the changes, because as I mentioned, this is really, creating now the sense that because the world population, all of the civilizations of the world are now encountering one another, they're meeting and they're now sharing ideas and thoughts, that the cultures and the civilizations of the world are merging very gradually. So this is not like suddenly we're going to now develop a global culture in which everybody's going to share the same values, the same principles of life and so on. Again, it's not about that. It's just that perhaps this is going to lead to, in the future, perhaps in the distant future, to the rise of a global culture in which all of the cultures of the world are merging, they're borrowing ideas from one another, and they're going to actually come together again and merge into a single global culture. And also what we see is that with that, again, we're going to also see what is called the rise of internationalism as well. The rise of internationalism. Okay, so what do I mean about that? What I mean is that there's more and more interaction between nations, particularly the United States. The 20th century is known as the American century, in which now the United States is beginning to step outside to interact with the rest of the world in a more significant way than it was in the past. For example, there are moments in which the United States participates, for example, in the conflicts, for example, in World War One, in World War Two, the Cold War that spanned between 1945 and 1991. We see a greater and greater, of course, interaction, there and in the world scene. The creation of the UN, for example, the United Nations, the first forum to bring the representatives from all over the world to discuss their problems and so on. And also world summits, again, that there are meetings of representatives or leaders of industry and commerce and cultures and religions, really now having global meetings, global conversations as well. So this is, again, what's called internationalism, in other words, that all of the nations of the world are now coming together again to increase their interactions and to create the sense, again, of more and more participation or cooperations as well. Okay. All right. It's a brief commercial break, if you will. All right. All right. So now that we have a greater understanding of globalization, now let's look into now part one, what is war, prosperity, and modernization. So once again, it was essential to first establish, globalization, what it is, that it has historical process and the world coming together because of technologies and so on. And now we got, of course, in the 20th century, internationalism. Now let's look at Texas. in terms of uh, now that we have like a background, okay, in which Texas is now part of globalization, looking at Texas in terms of war, prosperity, and modernization. Again, this is something that is going to be assessed as something that occurred in the 1940s and 50s. Okay, so we're going to look at just about 2 decades or so of Texas history, the 1940s and 50s, of how, because of World War II, Texas is going to become more integrated, if you will, in this global community or global, system, even though it's simply something that is just on the rise. In other words, there's no global system or anything. Just that there's far more encounters, more integration, more connectedness, if you will, and how Texas is also going to come into this process as well, through this process of uh, World War II. And then after the war, go through this process of prosperity and modernization, all of which were really directly tied to uh, to the post-war economies. Again, this wartime industrial production that really uh, got the United States out of the Great Depression, and we're going to see now another boom cycle, arising in the United States, another boom cycle that brought prosperity and it brought modernization to the state of Texas. Okay, so let us look then at Texas in the Second World War. First and foremost, very briefly, we're not going to, get into the Second World War, because that would be a whole different topic. But just the essential. In other words, how Texas, in a certain sense, participated, in the Second World War. In what ways, in other words, and how this war is going to change Texas society, the Texas economy, and the like. And remember, this is a conflict taking place in the international scene. It's a world war, but it's going to uh, have some form of influence in the way Texas is moving. Is again, Texas is no longer isolated once again from the rest of the world. So, the only thing I will mention again is that this war, of course, there will be a great enthusiasm, from the part of Americans, from the part of Texans as well, to participate, because what this war was all about is that there were three countries. Two were European, and one was Asian. It was Germany and Italy in Europe, and Japan in Asia, that were now expanding. They had imperial ambitions, imperial aspirations to expand and conquer different parts of the world. Okay. And those were the fascist states. Again, the rise of fascist states. Germany, Italy, and Japan have given rise to a new political and social system that was known as fascism, that simply boiled down to three main ideas, okay, that they represented. The kind of empires, in other words, that they wanted to build. They were really trying to build, large imperial systems. They were trying to build imperial systems based on three particular ideas or principles that are really the pillars of what is called fascism, okay, which is militarism. That is to say, they were building, great military war machines, that they were taking them into different parts of the world. The Germans, and they were, invading Europe, helped and assisted by the Italians as well, and the Japanese were also invading China, invading Asia as well. Not just China; they were pretty much invading all of Asia. Eventually, Hitler also invaded Africa as well. North of Africa will be invaded as well. So there were different regions, again, in which those fascist states were moving into, again, and trying to build empire again. So the idea of militarism, that is to say, military conquest, that is to say, building large war machines in order to take them into different parts of the world to build, again, an empire. So imperialism is another, component of fascism as well. There's militarism, imperialism, and of course, the third idea that those powers, represented is that they also represented what's called racism as well. Racism, that it was not just enough to be, building great war machines and using them for conquest and building empires, but that they also had ideologies, in which they place themselves as the superior race, even though there's only one race, and that is the human race, as a matter of fact, okay? There's only one race, and that is the human race, the human species. But they believe that the human species were divided into different races. Again, this is an artificial construct, by the way, but they believe very wholeheartedly that that's the way that the human species was actually divided, that there were different races and they were the superior races, and that there were inferior races that needed to be, of course, eliminated. So they committed atrocities, by the way. They were very well known for committing atrocities in Europe. Hitler is very well known for persecuting different groups, among whom there were the Gypsies, and the Jews as well, particularly those two, even though they also persecuted other groups as well. Okay, and the Japanese also, committed atrocities in China as well. Okay, because of racism in this case. So because of that, of course, because we see now on the rise, growing imperial systems that were now moving into different parts of the world, there will be a great enthusiasm, okay, in the United States to actually, try to liberate, in other words, the societies, the groups that were actually conquered, by those particular powers. And again, it is when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor in 1941 that this is when officially the United States steps in, okay, into the conflict, and now is going to fight Germany, Italy, and Japan. Again, is going to now, of course, try to stop, in other words, Hitler and Japan, particularly along with Italy, again, from actually achieving their goals. And so FDR, the president, mobilizes the nation as the United States enters the war, and 16 million troops are mobilized. This is going to be the largest army in the world, 16 million troops. Now that we have a very quick overview or background, again, of this very first, if you will, global, conflict, now let's look at Texas, okay? So how Texas is going to be influenced now by World War II, how Texas is going to participate in this global conflict, and what kind of changes are we going to see taking place, okay, in the state. So first and foremost, let me look at the... Okay, so first and foremost, we see that Texas also, because the FDR is mobilizing, okay, the population is trying to raise the largest army in the world, 16 million troops. Texas is going to, join the U.S. Army, okay, first and foremost. There will be military development taking place in the state of Texas. Military development, because there was an urgency, and once again, in the United States, as well as in Texas, people felt that this had to be done. There's a great, courage and enthusiasm felt by Americans and Texans, of course, to join the army to try to actually help, their countries that Hitler was invading and so on, pretty much to free them and so on. Okay, so Texans joined the army, and there will be about 750,000, Texans that joined the U.S. Army, out of which 12,000 were actually women. Okay, 12,000 were women. Okay, so extremely important. Now, the peoples of Texas are enthusiastically participating again by joining the army, and there will be, of course, military development as well. In terms of, as we'll see again, how this is going to shape, the economy in Texas as well. The military development also is going to lead to economic development, as we'll see. But what's also very remarkable, in this transition is that there will be, great personalities in the Second World War that came from Texas. For example, Dwight Eisenhower. Okay, Dwight Eisenhower, he was the actual supreme commander of the U.S. forces in Europe. In other words, he was actually leading the liberation of Europe from Hitler. Okay, and he's from Texas, Fredericksburg, Texas. Okay, and eventually, because he is going to succeed in this campaign to liberate France and Belgium, Holland, and other countries that were occupied by the Nazis. When the war comes to an end and he returns, he will be elevated as as a national hero. And in 1950, he will be elected president of the United States. Dwight Eisenhower. Again, he's from Texas again. So this is, something to note. It's remarkable again. There were also part of this military development, again, when Texas joins the U.S. Army, is that there will be minorities, of course, in Texas that joined the Army as well, okay? There were, for example, Mexican-American Army units. A great many of them were all Mexican Army units. In other words, that back during this time, still, the U.S. Army was segregated, okay, in terms of the different ethnicities served in, particularly minorities, in different units. That is to say, like the Mexican, for example, the all Mexican Army units, for example. That's one way of looking at this. There were, of course, from Texas, from South Texas, a great many of them that joined the Army. We also see African Americans. Okay, African Americans, about 257,000. African Americans as well are going to join the U.S. Army to fight in World War II. A third of the African Americans that joined the Army served in segregated units, and they were, at the same time, as I mentioned, not just that those units were segregated, the facilities were also segregated, okay, in which the specific location or the base in which people train and so on, they were also segregated as well. So again, this is something that we're going to get to see in session 2, particularly when we look at the civil rights movement, the 1960s and so on, the issue of segregation. So we move forward then, because part of this military development was also entailed, of course, the building of military bases. Okay? Military bases are going to be built that were essential for the training of soldiers, whether they were in the Army or Air Force, etc. There will be a series of military bases that will be built during World War II across Texas, like in Austin, Corpus Christi, Houston, Lubbock, Midland, San Angelo, San Marcos, and Wichita Falls. So there's a series of bases, once again, that were um, very strategic in terms of the land, the available land that was in Texas, that was very suitable for, let's say, training or Air Force, training as well. The open ranges, the open skies, the clear skies, etc. It was very convenient, very advantageous, again, for those kinds of exercises and so on, again. So we see, of course, that one way that Texas is going to change or be influenced by, World War II is, that there's military development, there's military bases, and along with it, as I mentioned just a moment ago, is that there will be also wartime production, okay? Because with military development and bases and so on, the United States as a whole, by the way, this is not just, Texas, but the U.S. economy now moves into what is called wartime production. The U.S. economy as a whole, and in terms of Texas, likewise, the state now goes into this type of production as well. So historians look back and indicate that what really got the U.S. out of the Great Depression of the 1930s was World War II. There's no doubt about that. And it got Texas out of the Great Depression as well. Okay. So what do we mean about wartime production? Okay, so what it means is that the military bases require industries, require certain services for their operations. Okay, such as, for example, there were aircraft factories. Okay, so there's going to be Air Force, again, bases. Okay, like in San Antonio, for example. Well, you need factories, of course, for manufacturing planes and so on. So that led to that particularly, again, aircraft factories, shipyards as well, oil refineries, and steel plants. Well, you need steel, you need iron for the construction of planes. You need more diesel, more gasoline, so on, in order to, move the equipment, the jeeps, and so on. All of the military transportation facilities, they require that service, they require that product. So there will be more oil refineries as well. So there will be more, again, more economic development. Okay, so by default, with the increasing presence of bases, what we're going to see is, again, more and more production. This is part of the wartime production that is simply going to persist even after the end of the Second World War. Okay, it's wartime production to sustain the military bases, for example. Okay, and what that led is that higher employment. Okay, so there will be more jobs, for example. Okay, more jobs are going to because there's new industries, because there's new manufacturing plants and the like. Well, there's going to be a lot of people employed, again, in those growing enterprises. Okay, and of course, higher wages as well. So this is getting slowly but surely, Texas out of the Great Depression. Also, what takes place, okay, in Texas, besides the development, again, military development, again, is the rapid mechanization of farms. This is part of this wartime economy, this wartime production. is that it's not just that we see the development of a military with bases and new industries, but also agriculture itself is going to rapidly change in that because there was now the necessity to mass produce food products to feed the troops, for example, or to feed the population in the city in which, because millions of farmers are leaving the farm to join the army. So in the countryside, many farmers are simply abandoning their farms to join the army. So it was required to simply mechanize agricultural production. So, of course, something that is also going to take place is that uh, there'll be an agreement signed with Mexico. The United States and Mexico signed an agreement for Mexico to send farm workers, farm labor into the United States to grow crops, because the American farmer is just moving to Europe, is moving to Japan to fight Japan in World War II. So there's the need for food production. So one of the solutions is, well, we need to rapidly mechanize, again, our farms, invest in tractors, in irrigation systems, more so than it was in the past, to rapidly mechanize the process of production. And in this process, Texas is going to, by necessity, devote a good portion of the land, of the fertile land that it has, the good soil, for the growth of what is called crop consumption agriculture. So instead of relying on king cotton and simply saying, well, all we need is cotton because that has been the traditional crop, and there is a certain demand of cotton in the world market. Well, now the demand is food. Okay, the demand is, again, food products. So by necessity, farmers in Texas will have to rapidly adapt to this new demand, and there's now a greater demand for food. So therefore, this is going to bring the end to King Cotton in Texas. In other words, cotton will no longer be the dominant crop of the state, okay? Because we're now seeing a transition towards crop consumption agriculture, a diversification, again, of agriculture in terms of, Texans actually choosing to grow different kinds of crops, from vegetables like onions, tomatoes, spinach, for example, sorghum, and so on, in order to diversify. There's a demand for those products. So this is what Texas farmers are now doing. They're trying to grow food products, in other words, just food exclusively for the market, because there's a demand for that, okay? And to feed the troops, to feed the population of the U.S., and so on. All right, so we continue. What this mechanization did, okay, this mechanization of farm agriculture, farm production, is that it also led to the decline of what is called tenancy and sharecropping. So because now farmers are in business, there's a demand for products. So a great many farmers are now staying in business, making payments, they're paying back their loans, and instead of paying rents on their lands, they're actually going to be buying lands or buying farms that they previously owned, and so on, because the economy is now booming. In other words, it's a booming economy. There's money to be made because the demand for food products is rising. And so that led to the decline of tenancy. Tenancy is simply farmers that have to pay rent, to stay on the farm. So they will not be evicted, that is to say. Those farms they previously owned, but they lost it because they were unable to pay back loans. So we see the decline of that, and even sharecropping as well. Sharecropping is simply, again, a farmer that does not have any land, and it just grows crops on the land of a merchant or an investor or a larger landowner in order to actually grow crops, but he has to actually pay a share. of the crop, share of the harvest, just to be there working the land again. So it's almost like you're paying rent, but you're paying rent with a share of the crop. In other words, so it declined from 244,000 to 169,000. This sharp, again, decline taking place, which was really, again, a good sign in Texas, because the problem has been pretty much in Texas that many farmers were losing ground and they were losing their farms. And many of them were becoming tenant farmers, paying rent, in other words. But this is wartime production, so that's, changing very rapidly, this situation. All right, so another important change here is a massive expansion of animal farms and ranches in Texas, because again, the need for more, for example, protein intake, more meat, for example. So we see a massive expansion again of cattle ranches and animal farms, to grow cattle, goats, sheep, horses, massive. Yeah, this is a wartime economy. Okay, so this is, Texas is really succeeding in this endeavor, in that it's not just mechanizing agriculture and is, diversifying the crops, but it's also, again, pretty much expanding animal farms and ranches as well, that were also quite important in the past, but they're now expanding. And it will become, by 1945, by the end of World War II, Texas ranked 4th place in farm and animal production in the United States, okay, in the U.S. as a whole. So the state of Texas is moving forward economically, again, because it has the setting, okay, the setting for the development of farming of animals and crops and so on. It has pretty much, been a state that devoted its energies in that particular system of production, anyways, in the past, but right now it's acquiring greater and greater importance, because those products are feeding the country now, okay, in times of war, okay, and feeding the troops as well, okay. So now, at this juncture, what we're going to see is that as World War II comes to an end, this wartime production, okay, this war economy, so to speak, remains very, very stable and steady across not only years but even decades after the end of the war. Part of the reason for that is that after the end of World War II, we're now going to see the beginning of what is called the Cold War. Okay, the Cold War, just in very general terms, was simply a competition, between the United States and the Soviet Union, to influence the development of the third world. Okay, so let me explain that, because so what is this, in other words? So what that means is that after the end of the Second World War, there was a host of countries around the world that were previously living under colonial rule. There were colonies. There were colonies of Europe. Okay, there were colonies, for example, in Africa. Europe had colonized Africa. It had established a series of colonies in Asia, and so on. And there were in Latin America a host of different Latin American countries that, even though they had gained independence from Spain, they were colonies of Spain, and they gained their independence in the early part of the 1800s, they were nonetheless have not yet developed, again, a national economy. So all of the nations of the world that were living under colonial rule, that had either gained independence in the 1800s or barely gaining independence after the Second World War from Europe, they had to shape their national economy. They had to determine they had to decide what kind of economic system they were going to build. And so the Cold War was really a competition between two superpowers. One was the United States, that promoted, capitalism. In other words, that this is the best possible economic system that is going to guarantee, economic prosperity for your country. So if you build your national economy under capitalism, you're going to experience great economic growth. In other words, that was one. And he competed with the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union was trying to influence the developing world. The developing world, once again, are all of the nations that lived under colonial rule and that were either barely gaining independence in the 20th century or gaining independence in the 19th century. And that now they have to decide what kind of economic system to build. And the Soviet Union was trying to also influence, the development of those societies, but under communism. In other words, we had the struggle between capitalism and communism. In other words, a competition. And so it is really, after the Second World War, when we're going to see now two superpowers trying to influence the rest of the world, whether to develop under capitalism or communism again, that because there's a competition between those two superpowers, this wartime economy remained. In other words, even though there was no real war being waged between those two superpowers, despite that fact, it is because there is a state of mistrust and misunderstanding between the two sides, that two sides were trying to just maintain, if you will, systems of defense, for national defense and so on, that enable, in this case, the U.S. to maintain a wartime economy. Even though it was not at war, it was almost like being prepared for it, in other words. So wartime industrial production pretty much remained steady, even after the end of World War II, now as we move into the Cold War. Okay, so that particular phenomenon called the Cold War enabled, therefore, the United States, in this case, the peoples of Texas, the Texas state, to continue under a boom, an economic boom, the same economic boom that the United States experienced during the Second World War. This same economic boom is going to now continue into the latter part of the 1940s and into the 1950s and 60s. There will be, a 20-year period at the very least, again, of economic growth in which wages were maintained, employment, etc., because of this wartime economy of the Cold War. Okay, so again, Texas is going to now enter into a period of relative prosperity. Okay, as we move into the late 40s, 50s, and 60s, the prosperity that was again, with higher employment rates and wages, higher standards of living. And that, of course, is going to transform the state of Texas in a way that is going to further push this project of modernization even further. Okay, it will accelerate, in other words, this project of modernizing the economy, creating more enterprises, more industries. People are now going to move at a greater speed to the cities, and the cities of Texas are going to be transformed in very, very significant ways, all of which we're actually going to talk about in session 2 when we return. So when we return, we're going to now move into what is called prosperity and modernity in Texas after the Second World War, and look at what is called the second industrial revolution in Texas. So just in the context just of Texas history, this is the second wave of industrialization. The first wave of industrialization we already looked at again. That actually we looked at in the 7th topic. modernity and progress comes to Texas. A new industry like the lumber industry, oil industry, and the like. We took a look at that again quite extensively. It was something that occurred between 1876 and 1920, the first industrial revolution, so to speak, in Texas. But after the Second World War, as we'll see, Texas is going to go through a second industrialization wave, the second industrial revolution in Texas. This is a localized experience. In other words, this is not to say that the United States was going through the second industrial revolution at this time. This is Texas. And there were new industries, new enterprises that are going to actually hire millions of people again. And we're going to actually talk about all of them, very extensively when we come back in session 2. And after we look at, how Texas was prospering and modernizing after Second World War, we're going to be moving into part 2, Texas in transition, the transition of Texas between 1960 and 1986, and see how the state of Texas will continue to change in very dramatic, very drastic ways as well. Everything, when we come back, everything will be assessed then in session 2 of this 9th topic of the semester, titled Texas in the Age of Globalization. I'll see you then in session 2 when we come back. Thank you.